Level 1. The geometry of isolation. You do not breathe. You regulate. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Your resting heart rate is a forced, mechanical 58 beats per minute. Anything higher introduces microscopic tremors to your musculature. A tremor of 1 single millimeter at the muzzle translates to a terminal deviation of nearly 2 meters on the dust-choked valley floor, 1,800 meters below. The math is absolute. It is uncompromising. It is the only thing left in your world that makes perfect sense. Before the camouflage, before the endless, baked expanse of the Syrian desert, you were an architect of theoretical velocity. You were an unexceptional, deeply introverted high school physics teacher in Alexandria, Virginia. You spent your meaningless days mapping fluid dynamics, atmospheric drag, and terminal ballistics for apathetic teenagers, while your own life decayed in a quiet, heavily mortgaged suburban apartment. Your estranged wife, Sarah, used to ask what you were thinking about when you stared blankly at the television screen. You could never explain to her that you were calculating the trajectory of the dust motes caught in the shaft of afternoon light, measuring their descent speed against the artificial drafts of the air conditioner. Human interaction was an unpredictable, chaotic mess of emotions and unmet expectations. But mathematics was a sanctuary. It was clean. It never lied. That was exactly why Defense Intelligence Handler Marcus Thorne found you. Thorne did not care about your physical endurance, your sprint times, or your patriotism. He cared solely about your cognitive processing speed and your obscure published papers on environmental variables acting upon dense mass at extreme ranges. When he approached you in a sterile government cafeteria, he did not offer you a weapon. He offered you a pristine Kestrel wind meter and an unbalanced equation. He offered you an environment where your theories would have immediate, undeniable, and kinetic consequences under the impenetrable shield of plausible deniability. You accepted without hesitation. You left the failing school district, the suffocating bureaucracy, and the failing marriage for the absolute, crystalline truth of the tactical grid. Level 2. The overhead costs. The initial deployment to Forward Operating Base Gorgon stripped away whatever soft tissue remained of the suburban civilian. The military apparatus functions entirely on cold logistics and statistical probabilities. You are no longer an educator. You are a highly classified biological supercomputer, specifically designed for trajectory analysis. You actively despise the concept of close-quarters battle. CQB is an unpredictable, bloody frenzy of intersecting angles, blind corners, and sheer animal panic. It is a failure of planning. Long-range engagement is entirely different. It is a sterile, mathematical audit conducted from the heavens. The night insertion to the Overlook hide site at elevation 3,400 was a grueling, agonizing transaction in caloric expenditure. You carried exactly 62.5 pounds of localized operational gear up the jagged limestone cliffs. The weight consisted predominantly of dense lithium batteries, encrypted communication arrays, and high-grade optical glass. Beside you in the darkness crawled Sergeant First Class Michael Vance. They call him Reaper, a machine of a man whose singular programmed function is to pull the trigger. Vance does not do the math. He does not understand the wind deflection algorithms. You do the math. You are the spotter. You provide the flawless inputs. He executes the lethal output. The physical toll of this apex supremacy is brutally heavy. In the intelligence community, they refer to it as overhead costs. By the time you establish the hide site beneath a layer of thermal camouflage netting, the ambient temperature has spiked to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by a suffocating 12% humidity that cracks your lips and dries your corneas. You are already 31 hours into a designated 72-hour watch. To mitigate the inevitable cognitive decline, you consume a 200 milligram tablet of modafinil. Within 20 minutes, the chemical surges through your bloodstream, forcibly rewiring your synapses into a state of hyper-vigilant wakefulness. You do not feel tired. You do not feel human. You are awake. You are processing. Level 3. The Threat Matrix. You settle your skeletal frame into the dirt behind the Hensoldt Spotter 60. You press your bruised orbital bone against the black rubber eye cup, letting the entire chaotic world reduce itself to the perfectly illuminated parameters of a mil-dot reticle. Down in the valley, a sprawling compound of mud brick and rusted corrugated steel shimmers violently through the rising heat mirage. Somewhere inside that structural footprint is Tariq Al-Fayed, They call him the variable. You do not view him as a father, a leader, or even a human being. You view him merely as a dense biological mass that urgently needs to be subtracted from the geographic equation. Staring through the pristine glass, you run a continuous threat matrix analysis on the valley floor. You are perfectly insulated by distance, separated from the horrifying intimacy of taking a life by an unbreakable wall of specialized optics and atmospheric pressure. Compartmentalization is your primary, and perhaps only, survival mechanism. You tell yourself repeatedly that you are merely an objective observer of physics. A 190-grain Sierra Match King projectile is just dormant mass. When it eventually leaves the suppressed muzzle of Vance's .300 Winchester Magnum at 2,900 feet per second, it ceases to be a weapon and becomes a captive of gravity and lateral air movement. You close your eyes for exactly 2 seconds and calculate the ballistic coefficient. You open them and check the kestrel. You measure the crosswind, oscillating violently between 7 and 11 knots, originating from the 3 o'clock position. You even calculate the Coriolis effect compensation, adjusting for the literal rotation of the Earth beneath the bullet's intended flight path over the staggering distance of 1,800 meters. At that range, the bullet will experience a time of flight of exactly 3.4 seconds before achieving terminal impact. 3.4 seconds of absolute, terrifying silence where the math either proves true or fails completely. The rules of engagement are nothing more than a bureaucratic hurdle, an irritating administrative variable injected into your flawless mathematical formula. The rules require absolute visual confirmation, turning your high-powered optic into an unblinking, rigid chain of custody. You watch the compound doors. You do not look for faces. You look for physical dimensions, for interception rates, for the exact geometry of a man stepping into the kill box. The silence of the high desert is profound, deafening, broken only by the dry, precise clicking of your elevation turret being dialed, the suffocating crunch of shifting sand under your Kevlar, and the heavy, measured thump-thump of your own regulated heartbeat echoing inside your skull. Level 4. The calculus of decay. 55 hours of continuous, unblinking wakefulness stretch the human mind until it begins to fray at the absolute edges of its compartmentalization. The overlook hide site at elevation 3,400 has transitioned from a tactical vantage point into a suffocating, ultraviolet oven. You lie perfectly motionless beside Sergeant First Class Michael Vance, the two of you buried under the heavy thermal camouflage netting that traps the 104-degree ambient heat against your rigid Kevlar armor. The dead, electronic hiss of your noise-canceling headset is the only proof that you are still connected to the operational grid of Forward Operating Base Gorgon. You consume another 200 milligrams of modafinil, dry swallowing the chalky chemical, because water rationing requires a strict mathematical division of your remaining canteens. You calculate the exact evaporation rate of your own sweat as it pools in the crevices of your collarbone. You are a fluid dynamics equation, actively failing in real time. Through the heavy optical glass of the Hensoldt Spotter 60, the mud brick compound 1,800 meters below remains a static, unyielding geometry problem. You watch the dust swirl across the empty, sun-baked courtyard, your brain automatically running a continuous wind deflection algorithm to anticipate the unpredictable thermals tearing through the canyon. You try to anchor your sanity to the pristine Kestrel wind meter resting inches from your face, relying on its digital LCD screen to provide undeniable objective reality. But the reality is slipping. Your mind drifts uncontrollably back to Alexandria, Virginia, to the sterile government cafeteria where Defense Intelligence Handler Marcus Thorne first laid out the threat matrix analysis of this operation. Thorne spoke of Tariq al-Fayed not as a man, but as a severe logistical bottleneck in a global supply chain of violence. You realize now, staring through the thick glass, that Thorne's clinical boardroom audit trail completely omitted the visceral, crushing gravity of the physical execution. Thorne bought the math, but he forced you to pay the overhead costs in blood, extreme caloric deficit, and raw cognitive decay. Level 5. The fracturing of the lens. Hour 62 breaches your final psychological defenses. The modafinil ceases to act as a stimulant, and instead becomes a rigid, vibrating cage around your exhausted consciousness. The isolation is profound, absolute, and deeply terrifying. You look at Vance. The shooter has not shifted his weight in over 6 hours. His breathing is a microscopic, highly regulated flutter. His finger rests passively above the sear of the suppressed 300 Winchester Magnum. He is a machine, perfectly adapted to the geometry of death. But you are fracturing under the weight of the variables. A severe, high-pitched tinnitus begins to ring in your ears, harmonizing endlessly with the dead hiss of the comms. Your hypervigilance metastasizes into a crippling, suffocating paranoia. You can no longer turn off the trajectory analysis. A solitary desert falcon banks violently against the thermal updrafts above the valley floor, and without conscious thought, your brain instantly calculates the lead required to end its flight. Altitude, velocity, wind resistance, ballistic coefficient. The numbers cascade across your vision like an inescapable digital overlay. You try to force the thoughts away, gripping the cold metal of the elevation turret, but the math is bleeding into everything. You remember your ex-wife Sarah Pendleton, standing in your suburban kitchen, crying because you could not look at her. Without analyzing the geometric distance between your bodies, you realize with a cold, terrifying certainty that the sterile algorithms you use to insulate your conscience are now entirely consuming it. You are no longer observing the physics are observing you. You are trapped forever behind the scope, unable to view the world as anything other than a series of intersecting, lethal lines. Level 6. The interception rate. Hour 71. The sun begins its brutal descent behind the jagged limestone cliffs, stretching long, sharp shadows across the valley floor. The ambient temperature rapidly drops, causing the metal of Vance's rifle to contract slightly. You hear the faint, metallic ping of the cooling suppressor tube, a sound that instantly snaps your fragmented mind back into the rigid, uncompromising parameters of the mission. The hallucinations recede. The math solidifies. The heavy wooden door of the central mud brick structure swings open. A solitary figure steps into the fading, amber light. Tariq Al-Fayed. The variable has finally entered the equation. All physical exhaustion vanishes, replaced by a terrifying, clinical clarity. Your resting heart rate drops immediately back down to a forced 58 beats per minute. You do not see a human being pausing to check his watch in the dusty courtyard. You see a dense biological mass with a specific thermal signature, presenting an interception rate of 99.9%. You glance at the pristine kestrel. The wind has shifted, dropping to a steady 8 knots from the 2:30 position. Wind is 8 knots, right to left. Distance is 1800. You whisper into the headset, your voice entirely devoid of all humanity. A pure, sterile transmission of operational data. Hold left 0.6 mils. Elevation is plus 14.2. Vance does not reply. He does not need to. The dry, precise click, click, click of his elevation turret being dialed confirms the data transfer. You stare unblinking through the spotter 60, watching Al-Fayed exhale a cloud of gray breath into the cooling air. The rules of engagement have been mathematically met. The unblinking optic serves as your unbreakable chain of custody. Send it. You whisper. The suppressed rifle recoils with a sharp, metallic crack. For exactly 3.4 seconds, the entire world ceases to exist. There is no sound, no wind, no heat. There is only a 190-grain Sierra Match King projectile traveling at 2,900 feet per second across the vast, empty expanse. Terminal impact is achieved. You observe a sudden, violent kinetic energy transfer. The mass of Tariq Al-Fayed simply ceases to occupy its previous coordinates, his thermal signature rapidly bleeding out into the cooling desert floor. The math resolves perfectly to zero. The complex equation is permanently balanced. Level 7. The audit trail. When you finally sit across the freezing, stainless steel table from Defense Intelligence Handler Marcus Thorne, the debriefing feels entirely synthetic, a grotesque parody of corporate accounting. Thorne sits in a perfectly pressed uniform, smelling of sterile air conditioning and aftershave. You mechanically recite the exact atmospheric data, the documented time of flight, the precise terminal ballistics of the 190-grain Sierra Match King projectile upon impact. Level 8. The return to the void. Your inevitable medical discharge is processed with the same sterile, unfeeling efficiency as the kill call. You are shipped back to Alexandria, Virginia, returning not as a victorious soldier, but as a broken, highly classified artifact of an invisible war. The civilian world is excruciatingly slow, excessively loud, and terrifyingly chaotic. Level 9. The permanent cage. You walk down the street to a mundane suburban coffee shop, desperate to anchor your fracturing mind to the illusion of civilian normalcy. The barista, Chloe, a young woman in a green apron, smiles at you with innocent, unwitting warmth. You look at her collarbone. Your mind instantly, violently calculates her exact distance at 1.2 meters. She senses the danger. You are the anomaly in this peaceful room. You are the apex predator, completely paralyzed inside a transparent, mathematical cage. Level 10. The inevitable collapse. The final collapse occurs 2 days later. You meet your estranged wife, Sarah Pendleton, at a sterile concrete park bench near the Potomac River. As she speaks, her desperate, emotional words disintegrate into meaningless phonetic static. You look past her shoulder, measuring the wind rippling across the dark water. She looks deep into your empty, unblinking eyes and realizes with horrifying clarity that you are not sitting on the bench with her. You are still 1,800 meters above the dust-choked valley floor. The story you just heard is a work of fiction, but the systemic architecture, the corruption, and the brutal mathematics of this world are entirely real and operating right now. A loop without end is greater than. If this descent into the shadows made you question the systems around you, drop a comment below and tell me your biggest takeaway. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next deep dive into the abyss. See you in the next one.